I'm Tacey Goheen, the Director of Community Services. Welcome to our May edition of Healthy Dynamics. Today is Thursday, May the 28th. We have a wonderful guest here with us today for our topic of mindfulness and meditation for quality of life and healing, which we all could use right now, so it's very timely. Our guest speaker is Susan Yelverton. Some of you may know her as the daughter of our own residents, Ben and Joanne Yelverton. Susan was here with us a couple years ago in 2018 and presented a course, several weeks of meditation and mindfulness series, and really enjoyed that, and many of our residents enjoyed that as well. So we are glad to have Susan with us. And without further ado, I'll ask Susan to please get started. She is a counselor at the Live Oak Counseling Center, is a licensed independent social worker, and is just a great heart and a great source of knowledge. So welcome, Susan.
So thank you all so much for having me here. I always love being at Still Hopes, and I appreciate being included in your Healthy Connections program. And prior to coming, Tacey gave me some of the questions that you all had about mindfulness. And I had time to kind of reconfigure my talk to speak specifically to your questions, which were wonderful. And they kind of fell into three categories, which were the same three categories that I kind of divided my talk about mindfulness into, which is what is mindfulness, how do you do mindfulness, and why should you do mindfulness? But I definitely wanted to speak to some of your specific questions, so I hope that I touch on everything. So anytime that you talk on any subject, you should probably start with a definition. Mindfulness is a pretty common word these days. We hear it a lot, but it is a big word, and so it's helpful to have a working definition. There's a lot of definitions of mindfulness floating out there, and some of them are pretty nebulous sounding, but I like this one from Jon Kabat-Zinn. And Jon Kabat-Zinn is pretty famous in mindfulness circles because he created a program called Mindfulness-Based Stress Reduction, where he used mindfulness with people with chronic pain up in Massachusetts in the 70s and 80s, and used it as a way for people to manage their chronic pain. And was able to kind of scientifically prove that the mindfulness approach helped people with chronic pain more so than medication. And so he got a lot of attention, clearly, from that. His definition, I like it because it's very meaty, and there's 4 parts of it. He says, mindfulness is the awareness that arises from paying attention in a particular way, on purpose, in the present moment, and non-judgmentally. So I thought I'd spend a little time kind of breaking that definition apart. Because then we start with the first word, which is awareness, which is another kind of weird and nebulous word sometimes. But the pieces of the definition are a little bit more specific. For example, the first part is paying attention in a particular way. And we all kind of have a sense of what paying attention is. We pay attention when we do a crossword puzzle, or we pay attention when we button our shirt. We may pay attention when we're getting our food each day. And we probably also have a sense of what it feels like to not pay attention. And a good example of these two kind of dualities is when you're driving and you're mindlessly driving, and then the person in front of you slams on the brakes, and then all of a sudden you're very mindfully driving, whereas like 2 seconds before you weren't really thinking about what you were doing. You suddenly know, my hands are on the wheel, my foot is on the brake, I'm here in traffic. This has happened to me recently. And you suddenly become quite aware of where you are and what you're doing. You were doing the same thing before, but your mind and your body were not kind of aligned. So paying attention means that your mind and your thoughts are focused on what is happening in the present moment. So the second part of it is on purpose. And my example of the car was that's accidental mindfulness, right? When the brakes slam. But on purpose means that we're going to try to make the shift intentionally without somebody slamming on brakes, that we're going to maybe drive down the road and say, oh, I'm driving down the road. My hands are on the wheel. And intention is important because it leads us to choice, the choice to be present in this present moment. But then the third part, now we've talked about that we're going to pay attention and we're going to do it on purpose. But the third part is, what do we pay attention to when we're mindful? And the quick answer is we're going to pay attention to the present moment. But that seems like kind of also a pretty nebulous thing to pay attention to. So there are 5 ways that we can kind of come into the present moment. And you know them already, because there are 5 senses. We can become present by focusing on what we're hearing, by what we're feeling, by what we're smelling, by what we see, and by what we taste. I think I got all 5 of those. So we can come into the present moment anytime that we notice the sounds around us, notice what we're feeling, notice what we're smelling. And the present moment is a moving target, because this moment right here is now the past, and now we're in this moment. So moment-to-moment awareness means that we are constantly moving our attention on purpose and focusing on what is happening right now. And so when we think about that, these 3 things, we're going to pay attention in a particular way, we're going to do it on purpose, we're going to pay attention to the present moment. One thing that's always happening in the present moment, God willing, is that we're breathing. We can't ever go anywhere and accidentally leave our breathing at home. It's always with us. So one of the foundational practices of mindfulness is to focus on our breathing. Breathing in and breathing out. But we almost never are sitting around thinking, I'm breathing in, I'm breathing out. That's one of the great things about breathing. You can do it without thinking about it. But mindfulness is just that. It's thinking about what we're doing. So we're going to do a quick practice right now of just 60 seconds of breathing in and breathing out. And the only instruction is to simply think and notice, because it's really beyond thinking. It's just noticing the act of breathing. So I will ring the bell and we can begin. And breathing in. You don't have to change your breathing in any way, just normal breathing. So that was 60 seconds of mindful breathing. So it's pretty interesting, I think, sometimes to just notice how that feels different than your daily life. One of the things that often comes up when we start practicing mindfulness is the 4th part of our definition, which is what we want to do is be non-judgmental in the way that we practice mindfulness. But we often find a lot of judgment arises when we are practicing. And judgment is any thought that has value attached to it. It might be, oh, this feels really good, I like this. Or it might be like, ugh, this feels bad, I don't like this, or I'm doing it wrong. And when judgment arises, our emotions always follow. A positive judgment is going to lead us to feel really positive emotions. A negative judgment is probably going to lead us to feel really negative emotions. So being non-judgmental when we practice mindfulness allows us to really be with what is without putting a judgment label on it. And it allows us to kind of be in the present moment without kind of going on the roller coaster ride of this is good or this is bad or this is right or this is wrong. But if you were like me, when I first started practicing mindfulness, all that I felt initially was judgment. Oh, I'm doing it wrong. Nobody's mind race is like mine. And so one of the nice things we can do in that moment is to know that we're not alone. If you are struggling with judgment as you practice mindfulness, then welcome. You are doing it correctly, because we're all struggling with judgment. And the goal is that when we notice a judgment, that we notice it and we let it go and we return to the breath, because we always have the breath to return to. So now we have finished with our definition. We're paying attention in a particular way to what's happening. We're doing that on purpose. We're paying attention to the present moment, and we're going to try and do it non-judgmentally. And we notice our judgments, we'll try and let them go and return to the present moment. So being mindful means that we're kind of watching these things come and go. Almost like we're standing beside a river and we're watching kind of the leaves and the sticks follow along the river, but we're not following after them. We're just kind of watching them come and go. So it's important to know that mindfulness is bigger than thinking. We can be mindful by simply noticing the sensations in our body without thinking. And sometimes that's nice because it gives us a break from our thinking. So we're going to do another quick 60-second practice. And the goal of this practice is just like the first practice. We're just going to try to focus on what it feels like to breathe. But if we're human, we're going to probably think a thought. And so we'll notice when we have a thought and then try to let that thought go and come back to focusing on the breathing. And for most people, that's going to happen a bunch of times in 60 seconds, maybe more than 60 times. So let's do a second practice. And begin with a nice deep breath and out. And again, we're not trying to change our breathing in any way, just breathing normally. But trying to focus our attention on the act of breathing and noticing when it wanders and bringing it back. That was another mindfulness practice. And if you're like me, you probably notice your mind wander more than once. Whenever I'm leading a mindfulness practice, I often notice that my mind wanders towards the future. It thinks ahead to, what will I say when this is over? And I have to remember to bring myself back to the present moment, because all that's being required of me in that moment is just to breathe. So when we are in awareness like that, we also notice a lot about what is happening around us. And I wanted to answer a specific question about the definition of mindfulness because someone asked if it's like prayer. And one of my very favorite kind of quotes about mindfulness is that when we pray, we're talking to God. But when we are in mindfulness, we can allow God to talk to us. because when we're very open and receptive what's happening, very frequently I find that what happens feels divine. So now we are done with the definition, and we're on to how do I become mindful? How do I get to be more mindful? And the questions in this section, someone asked, is mindfulness the same as meditation? How often and how long should I meditate? Do I have to close my eyes? Does music help? Do I have to sit cross-legged? And are there different forms of meditation? So I want to answer all of those questions. I'll answer the cross-legged one first. No, you do not. No, you absolutely do not. So you often hear the terms mindfulness and meditation used together separately, and you might wonder, are these the same thing? Are they different? The class that I am currently taking is called Mindfulness Meditation Teacher Training. And so that kind of sounds like a redundancy almost. But when I think of mindful meditation, I think of the term strength training. When you go to the gym here to do strength training, strength is the capacity or the skill that you're trying to build, and training is how you build it. And so with mindfulness meditation, mindfulness is a capacity for awareness, and we build it by meditating. And we can meditate in two ways. There are two broad ways: formal meditation and informal meditation. In the same way that if we go to the gym, we are like formally trying to build our muscles, right? But we can also build our muscles in day-to-day life by carrying groceries or opening a door or picking up something. And so we can train in mindfulness either formally in a formal practice or informally anytime during the day that we notice what we're doing and we move our attention to be in the present moment. So that idea that mindfulness is like strength training is a pretty good metaphor, because it helps us understand that mindfulness is to strength, that training is to meditation. And it also reminds us that we can do it formally like we would do at the gym, or we can do it informally in our daily life. So it's a really good metaphor. And there's another great idea that anything you can do mindlessly, you can do mindfully. So anything that you can do in the world that you've done mindlessly, you're now invited to do mindfully. When I first started training in mindfulness, I read about Thich Nhat Hanh, who is a Buddhist monk who now lives in France. He's originally from Vietnam. And he wrote a book about doing day-to-day chores in a mindful way. And my family thought they'd won the lottery, because I immediately began to want to do the chores that I never wanted to do before. Got a lot of joy out of them because I was really focused on them. Instead of washing the dishes at night and thinking about other things or what I had to do, I just washed each dish and enjoyed the smell of the soap and the feel of the dish in my hands. It didn't move very quickly, but the dishes were very clean. And I got a mindfulness practice out of it. So a question was, how often and for how long should we practice mindfulness? And Thich Nhat Hanh says that a good mindfulness goal, and I like this one, is to take one mindful breath a day. That's a goal I think we can all meet. And so I think we should do that right now. So let's all take in one mindful breath and release. And in that moment, we may get a sense that there have been many days that have passed where we didn't take one mindful breath, not one breath where we just focused on, I'm breathing right now. So that's a nice beginning. But also, we have done 2-minute-long practices already today. My suggestion is to start with a minute and build. Some people have time in their day to do a 30-minute breathing meditation. My life does not allow for that right now, so I generally do about 5 minutes in the morning. But more important, I think, than the duration is the frequency, trying to make being mindful something that we do each day, even for a little tiny moment. So the last section is, what are the benefits of mindfulness? And I got a lot of questions that really touched my heart about, especially right now, especially in this time of coronavirus and COVID-19, of being in quarantine, of being separated from people. How can mindfulness be of benefit to me? And the specific questions I got were, can it help with anger, frustration, and fear, which are pretty difficult emotions to feel? One question that I got that I really related to said, my mind is going all the time and I'm constantly thinking of things, bad things that might happen in the future, and can mindfulness help with that? And how can it help me right now, especially in light of how kind of separated or isolated some of us may feel? So when I thought about all the things that mindfulness can do, now if you read any magazine about mindfulness, they've got so many scientific studies that say mindfulness can improve your mood, it can decrease anxiety, it can decrease depression, it can improve your physical health, it reduces stress. The most recent article I read is that it lengthens our telomeres, which are the caps at the end of our DNA, and can help with lengthening our lifespan. So wow, it can do a whole lot of things. But specifically, how can it help us right now when we're all probably feeling pretty scared and not knowing what the future holds? And so I think about this quote by Viktor Frankl, which I think is a pretty appropriate quote for right now. Viktor Frankl was a Jewish, I think he was a psychiatrist or a psychologist, and lived in Europe during the Holocaust and was interned in a work camp. And he wrote a beautiful book called Man's Search for Meaning. And kind of the point of the book was to say many people experienced the same stimulus, which was being interned in this prison camp. But everyone kind of responded to it differently. And he really explored in that book why some of us respond differently. And so one of the famous quotes from that book is this one. It says, "Between stimulus and response, there is a space. And in that space is our power to choose our response. And in our response lies our growth and our freedom." And I especially like that quote because it's got the word freedom in it. And often I hear about mindfulness that it helps us to become more free. And at this time of being kind of told more what we can and can't do, a sense of feeling free is probably pretty important, or it is at least to me. And so mindfulness allows us to focus on that space that he's talking about. Something's happened. And before we respond to it, we can take a pause and notice how we're feeling. When we don't pause, really what we do is react. And if you've ever kind of snapped at somebody or gotten very angry or frustrated or made a decision that you didn't like, you probably felt like a reaction. But the pause in the space allows us to respond in an effective way. And so I like that mindfulness allows us to spend time on that space. The second question was about how our mind travels to the future and tells a bunch of kind of maybe scary stories about what might happen in the future. And can mindfulness help us with that? And when I think of my mind, I think of it like a timeline. There's really three places our mind can be. It can be in the future. It can be thinking about 5 minutes ahead or 5 years ahead, or it can be in the past. It can be thinking about 5 minutes ago or 5 years ago or 5 decades ago. Or our mind can be in the present moment. And in the present moment, it can be one of two places. It can be in the present, or it can be judging the present. And judging the present is slightly different than being present because it means we've kind of taken a step away from the present and we're kind of making a judgment about it. So mindfulness is really helpful because it helps us pay attention to when our mind is telling stories. And our mind tells stories all the time. It tells stories about things that might happen in the future that haven't happened. It might retell a memory that we had. It may retell it a little better than it actually happened. I do that a lot. And so mindfulness is just the training of noticing when our mind is in one of those places and then just saying, okay, come on right back. It's kind of like training a puppy. You say, stay puppy, stay, and the puppy stays for about 2 seconds and then it runs off, right? And so mindfulness training means bringing your mind back again and again. And you want to do that as gently as you would with a puppy. Because if you fuss and yell at a puppy and you become judgmental with a puppy is not going to come back. So it's important to have a sense of gentleness with your own mind as you catch yourself maybe worrying about the future or catch yourself ruminating about the past. One of my favorite quotes about mindfulness is from Marsha Linehan, who created a type of therapy around mindfulness called dialectical behavior therapy. And she says that the importance of mindfulness is it brings us into the present moment. And that's important because it's the only place where we can make change. And we can't change the past and we can't pre-change for the future, but we can change for right now. And so that freedom to change brings us back to that idea that mindfulness can create a huge sense of freedom, where we have some space and we have some choice. And so one of the books that Thich Nhat Hanh, who is one of the mindfulness teachers I talked about before, wrote is a book called Be Free Where You Are. And he wrote that book for prisoners in a French prison. And he talked about how much freedom that they could feel, even as a prisoner in a prison. And I relate to that a little bit right now. There are times where being at home all day can feel very confining. And so I went back to that book because I thought it was important. And he wrote this in his book. He said, "For me, there is no happiness without freedom. And freedom is not given to us by anyone. We have to cultivate it in ourselves." So another piece of the definition of mindfulness is that we're going to cultivate freedom, which is a wonderful thing to do. And the last question that got asked was, do I use mindfulness as a therapist with my clients? And the answer is yes, all the time. In fact, therapy is really about being mindful of what's happening inside of us. Right now, we can think a lot about the outside world and that there's a lot that we can't change in the outside world and that we may feel confined to the inside of our apartment or our home or our room. But the part of the world that we always have control over is our inner environment, everything that happens inside of us. So one last mindfulness technique that I will leave with you is something I frequently do with my clients, and it is an acronym, and the acronym spells RAIN. And the R of RAIN is to recognize. When we start practicing mindfulness, we start to recognize what's happening in us. It might be a lot of worry thoughts, it might be physical pain, it might be both. But the first part, the R of RAIN, is to recognize what's happening inside of us. What's happening in me right now? And the A of RAIN is probably the hardest part, and that's to allow. Because frequently, when we recognize what's happening, we immediately say, well, I should not feel that, I should feel something different. So it's a very important piece of mindfulness. That non-judgmental stance means that we have to just allow things to be as they are. For a lot of us right now, I think if we sit long enough, I know this is true for me, something that I've recognized is grief. Grief for wishing that things were different than they are. Grief for losses of events and plans that I had. Grief for the loss of connection with people. So the A is important because we have to just allow that to be as it is. Not to say, well, I'll feel that tomorrow, or it's dumb for me to feel that way. When we allow something to be as it is, we feel it and it comes and goes. When we kind of shove it away or don't feel it, what we resist persists. So allowing something doesn't really mean inviting it to stay forever. It just means allowing yourself to kind of feel whatever comes up for you right now. The I stands for investigate. And we're back again to the non-judgmental stance of trying to get curious about what's happening with us. I'm feeling grief. I'm going to allow myself to feel that. Wonder why I'm feeling that. And when we can kind of get curious about our life, then we can start kind of figuring out the reasons why we do things and feel what we do, and give ourselves some compassion. And the N of RAIN is how we use that compassion, and that is to nurture whatever arises. And so if we're noticing that we're having some frustration or some sadness, then we can nurture it and maybe give ourselves some extra dessert to feel better, or a nap or a walk. These are all things I've been giving myself recently in light of how we're all feeling. So nurturing means noticing what is there and then loving it. So during this time of uncertainty and change, it's going to make a lot of sense that your thoughts will go to the future, of not knowing what the future holds. And one of the gifts of this time is that we never knew what the future held, and this is just a nice reminder. It's just kind of like the person who slams on brakes and gives us that nice reminder that we were never in charge of what is coming next. And so it is a time to practice. So I'm going to close with one last quote from Viktor Frankl, and I think it really kind of gets at the essence of the sense of freedom that I have been talking about, and that is this: everything can be taken from a person but one thing, the last of the human freedoms, which is to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way. So I thank you for letting me be here along the way with you, and I wish you mindfulness in the days to come. Thank you.
Susan, thank you so much for being here and giving us such great information, some questions that came from our residents, and really appreciate you focusing on those issues and helping us all to be more mindful in this sort of crazy time that we're in right now. Really appreciate it, and look forward to having you back when we're able to schedule some sessions and some courses with you. We're looking at a 5-week course on topics such as mindfulness of breath, mindfulness of body, mindfulness of thoughts, and maybe even beyond the 5 weeks. And so look forward to having you back, and of course residents will make sure you get that information as well. Thank you.